Hi, I'm John Messer. Welcome to Understanding Your Church with Systems Thinking. This is lesson one, and we're going to dive into systems thinking. And I would like to let you know that in this course, there will be a slide deck in which you'll have a recorded lecture with me, and then you'll also have a written document which you can use to reinforce your learning and use as a check. You'll have some quizzes along the way so you can find out if you're getting the content. So let's dive in. Understanding your church with systems thinking. I'm glad you're with me, and I use this picture because I want you to know that systems thinking, more than anything, is about being able to see the forest and the trees. It's an excellent illustration of a system. And so you might see a lot of pictures of forests because it's such a great illustration of systems thinking. In this course, you'll learn several things, but first you're going to learn that systems are everywhere. We don't recognize systems as systems. We're familiar with ecosystem or solar system or maybe nervous system. But a lot of systems aren't called systems, and so sometimes we miss the fact that they actually are a system. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about systems thinking and how it helps us see more clearly what is happening and why that's happening. And that's why that's so helpful in social systems like churches. We'll talk about some basic systems tools that helps you think in a systemic way about an issue or a problem. And more than that, it helps you distinguish between symptoms and problems. And then we'll talk about how you use systems thinking in your life, in your church, your business, in your school. Systems thinking is not just about one thing. Systems thinking applies to all of life. It's a new perspective. So in this lesson, we're going to look at a couple things. We're going to look at the fact that systems are everywhere, whether we realize it or not. Then we're going to talk a little bit about system properties and characteristics. And then we're going to compare linear thinking to systems thinking. Linear thinking is what we are familiar with. It's what we do by nature. It's our default thinking mode. Systems thinking is different. It's that new perspective. And so we'll compare the two. I'd like to share what the benefits are of systems thinking, and these are just a few of them, kind of from a church perspective. First, it helps me with a new perspective. It helps me see that what I do matters, but it doesn't all depend on me. I'm part of a system, but I am not in control of all the system. The other thing is, especially in a church or any social system, whether it's a school or business or hospital, it's really important to know that systems thinking helps us avoid the whole blame game. It helps us avoid the search for the bad guy. When something goes wrong, sometimes we look for the bad guy. We're looking for who made it happen. And that's not what systems does. Systems recognizes that it's the system that is the problem. It's not any one person. And so you don't have to go looking for the bad guy. In problem solving, it also helps you to actually get to solve problems rather than treating symptoms, which happens so often in social systems. We're actually treating symptoms rather than solving the real problem. And it's also very much a tool for transformation. It helps us really make powerful changes, and so that's one of the most important things about systems thinking. So what is systems thinking? Why is it so important? Well, it's if you don't understand the interrelatedness of things, we can actually try to apply solutions that cause more problems. And that's because we create unintended consequences from the fixes that we apply. It's also important because our simple questions often require more complex, in-depth thinking than we are used to giving it. Not everything is black and white and cut and dried. And so if we're going to find good solutions for real problems, systems thinking is a great help, a great benefit to doing that. Also for leadership, leadership by design, leadership with systemic purpose is much better than reactive leadership or just responsive leadership. Remember, we are trained from birth and linear thinking, which doesn't anticipate consequences. Um, and so learning systems thinking helps us to lead more effectively. And another great truth is that we can't solve problems with the same kind of thinking that created them. So if linear thinking is the kind of thinking that created the problem, systemic thinking or systemic thinking, systems thinking, can help us solve the problem. Okay, so what is a system? Well, Virginia Johnson and Lauren Anderson wrote that a system is a group of interacting, interrelated, or interdependent components that form a complex and unified whole. We'll pick that apart, but it's really important to notice interrelated, interacting, interdependent. In other words, we're not focusing on just individual parts. We're focusing on the interrelationships. We're focusing on how they are interdependent and how they work together. We can probably name all kinds of systems, but let's just name three. There are mechanical systems. Everybody has a mechanical system in their home: a furnace, air conditioner, cars. I like to think about a toaster as a mechanical system. Very simple, and its sole purpose is to make toast. And if it doesn't make toast, the system is broken. So what do? We get out the schematic, or we take to someone who can, and they replace the broken part. They put a new part in, it works and makes toast again. Well, that's a mechanical system. It doesn't work that way in social systems, as we'll see. A natural system, think of an ecosystem that has maybe subsystems, the flora and the fauna. Those systems are interactive, and all of those parts interact. Think about maybe the headlines of the changes that an ecosystem have seen when wolves were reintroduced, or the impact of cats on an ecosystem. Social systems are like families: a classroom, a church, a business, a hospital, a school. They are dynamically complex, meaning it's not just about how many parts there are, but it's about the interrelationships between all of those parts. Think about a church where you have 100 people and consider all of the possible interrelationships between 100 people in a church. It's an incredible number. If one person could have a relationship with 99 others, and then that second person could have a relationship with 99 other people, and you multiply that, it's just an incredible number. Dynamically complex. Why are things so complex in a church? Because dynamically, complexity is not just based on the numbers, it's based on the relationships between the parts. So a social system, church is a social system, a business is a social system. And social systems are what we're going to be focusing on as we talk about systems thinking. So what are the properties of a system? Well, there are several. Number one, they're adaptive, which means that a system adapts to its environment, to its needs. It has the capacity to self-organize, and that can be both good and bad. It can adapt in a healthy way. It can adapt in unhealthy ways. Systems are interconnected and interdependent, meaning one change impacts every part. If we change one thing, it impacts the whole system, whether it's apparent or not. Now, in a mechanical system, that's apparent, because if I take out one part, the toaster doesn't work anymore. Or if I change out a part in my car, like I take out a spark plug and I put in a different part, then it's going to work differently. Mechanically, I can identify that easily. In a social system, all of those interconnections are not quite so clear, and so we don't always see them. And again, systems are dynamically complex. It's because of the number of interconnections among the parts, not just because of the number of parts. Um, Systems maintain stability. They fluctuate, they adjust to maintain their stability. In other words, the way a system works is the way the system wants to work. And anything that tries to change the way the system works creates a momentum against it. There is a reaction against change. Okay, there is a reaction against change. That is the principle of a system that we encounter in churches, but we don't realize that's what it is. That's called feedback. It is the reaction, the response of a system to attempted changes. Because systems want to maintain their equilibrium, they want to maintain stability, the system will act against those changes. And we've all encountered that in a church. We've encountered that in all kinds of social systems. We just don't realize that that's what it is. And finally, systems also are part of larger systems. And we know that from like the human body, the nervous system, cardiovascular system, those are all part of the bigger body. The human body is a system. In your car, the electrical system, and in a social system, all of the subsystems are part of a bigger system. In a church, for example, you may have a ministry group, and you may have a leadership team, and you may have that. But all of those subsystems create the system of the church, and the church itself is a subsystem of a larger group, maybe part of a denomination or a group of churches. If not, it is at least part of the visible church on earth, and that is a system. It's the church system. So those are properties. Now, systems also have characteristics. And what that means is that every system has structure to it. It means that how the parts are arranged makes a difference, because the arrangement of the parts or the components of a system affect the way it carries out its purpose. It achieves its outcomes. It also means that systems produce feedback. They are constantly producing feedback. It's always available. We can learn to find that feedback and recognize it for what it is, and that's a large part of systems thinking. Also, a system produces leverage, or offers leverage, and that means that because all of the parts are interrelated, very often we don't have to make massive, huge changes to affect change in the system, right? That means that we can make smaller changes, and all we have to do is learn to find those leverage points so that we can make smaller, more subtle changes to actually bring change to the system. That's a really positive characteristic. Systems also demonstrate consistency. They always operate according to their properties. Their characteristics are always consistent, and that's one thing about a system. You will always find feedback. You will always experience some sort of reaction or feedback to attempted changes. That's because it's a system. Systems also demonstrate cause and effect, meaning, simply put, every change changes everything. And when we affect one part of it, we see an effect. And it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a rule change or a decision that is made or change in policy, that will produce an effect. And now the question is whether we recognize the effect and intended that effect, or whether that is an unintended consequence and that's actually undermining what we're trying to do. And finally, systems demonstrate completeness, that all of the parts have to be present for the system to perform optimally. Does that mean that a social system can't function? No, it means to perform optimally. Just like your human body, it's intended to perform optimally. But we have systems that are not functioning at 100%, and so we're still working, the body is still working, but it's not functioning optimally. So now let's take a look at linear thinking versus systems thinking. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever tried to make a change that actually made things worse? I have. I tried to make a change because I thought that it would be a really simple thing. Common sense told me I needed to make the change. I'm not going to tell you what it is. It's quite embarrassing. But what happened was I actually made the situation worse. Now, I know that people do that in their families, they do it in their businesses, they do it, and it, of course, happens at church as well. But think about it for a minute. What was the situation? What change did you make? And what did you think would happen? What were you expecting? And then what did happen? See, the difference between what you expected and what happened, that's the unintended consequence. That's the feedback that you're getting. And so what happens is the system reacts to your action, and very often, the consequence is not what we intend, because we base it on our assumptions, we base it on our common sense, so to speak, but we aren't thinking about it from a systems perspective. We're thinking about it from a linear perspective. Why do those changes make things worse? Well, we start with the best of intentions. No one tries to ruin something or to make it worse. We apply the best knowledge we have at the time, but we've learned to think in specific ways, and that way is linear thinking. And so what happens is very often we end up treating symptoms and not problem solving. We are soothing symptoms really, and that creates more problems in the future. And so sometimes we're dealing with the same problem over and over and over. I call that playing whack-a-mole. You know, the game where the mole pops up and then you whack him and then he pops up somewhere else and then he pops up somewhere else. That's what happens with linear thinking and problem solving. We're actually treating symptoms that keep popping up, and it's telling us that we're not really solving the problem. So what happens? The result is very often people in church get kind of tired, they get exhausted, they get frustrated, and sometimes they quit. Peter Senge said that systems thinking is a conceptual framework, a body of knowledge and tools. So it's knowledge and tools that have been developed to make the full patterns clear, to help us see how to change them effectively. It's a way of seeing wholes rather than parts and processes rather than static snapshots. That's important. It's very important to realize we're talking about seeing the forest, not just the trees. We're talking about seeing wholes, not just parts. We're talking about seeing processes, how parts are interrelated, and that interaction, that process, rather than just looking at pictures or snapshots of what is or what was. So let me use a diagram here to help you understand linear thinking. Linear thinking is called open loop thinking because it just goes, there's a problem, I'll apply a fix, done. That's just a straight line, okay? There's a problem, I'm going to apply this fix to it and it'll be done. Problem is that very rarely happens that way because we apply the fix and then we find out that we applied that fix, but that fix is having an impact. And sometimes it's a very negative impact because not only does the problem recur, but it comes back worse than it was to begin with. Why is that? Well, because we're not really dealing with the problem. We're trying to treat symptoms of the problem rather than actually treating the problem. And we're producing unintended consequences when we apply that fix that we weren't ready for. Thinking about systems in linear ways is unproductive because it's that linear analytical break everything down into its component part thinking that creates the quick fixes in the first place. I see a problem, I'm going to do this, and that'll solve the problem. That's quick fix thinking. And that's because it doesn't solve any problem. It doesn't get to the problem. So often it just gets worse. So when you're looking at a system, and that's why this is so important for churches, a church is a system, you cannot look at a system through linear eyes. You've got to use systems eyeglasses to look at a system. And that's because churches are social systems, not toasters. If a church was like a toaster, a mechanical thing, where I had a blueprint of all of the parts of the system, and that only did one part did one thing, and if it didn't function properly, I could just take that out and replace it. That'd be one thing, but that isn't how churches work. That's how toasters work. Churches are complex, dynamic, interdependent systems of human beings. And so when we see a problem and we try to apply a fix like that, we always end up very unhappy because there's a lot of feedback that comes back, and it's the unintended consequences that cause the pain and the heartache and the problems in a church. Church is not a toaster. A church is a social system. When we think about the unintended consequences around us, I just thought I'd highlight for you one of the recent headlines about the experts who are warning about the unintended consequences of the CDC mask guidance. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means um, that employing a specific policy regarding mask wearing, mask use, will produce consequences. And what this article is saying is that they're suggesting that those who were implementing this policy had not considered from a systems perspective that there would be unintended consequences. And so to think more clearly about this from a systems perspective would be beneficial. So even in headlines, we see evidence that systems thinking is being ignored and it's being recommended to be used. So systems thinking is beneficial not just for churches. It's beneficial for us in every sphere of our lives where we want to have a better perspective, a more effective, beneficial perspective on what really is happening around us and what can we really do to help or to change in those situations. So I look forward to seeing you in lesson 2, where we'll pick up on systems thinking and we'll take the next step. So that concludes our lesson. Thanks for being with me for lesson 1. I'll see you next time.